And I believe we're live. Hello and welcome. Good evening, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And welcome back to For the Love of Comics for another Sunday live stream. I'm glad to see people in the chat, but I know that it's always on a little bit of a delay to get across. So, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. I hope the audio is coming across fine. I hope you can see me all right. I can see in the chat the Comic Binge, Stuart, Stephen Johnson, um, Salit, and Lars Gunderson. Good to see all of you. Everything is coming through as far as the chat is concerned. Great to see it. Hope everyone had a good week, had a good weekend. As I always say, this is the wrap up for the week for me, and a wrap up for the weekend ended with a nice, quiet live stream. And today's live stream, for those of you who are familiar, these live streams generally have a topic, although not always, and they always ramble, so you're quite familiar with it. If this is your first time here, whether absolutely live right now, in case that is, do say hello, or if you're watching it recorded later, the topics do vary. And last week's live stream was just a rambling discussion about the terms overrated and underrated. And this week's live stream is going to actually specifically discuss three comics. And it is linked to last week's live stream because this is the video that I actually wanted to make. But getting into it, I started thinking about all of these things that I discussed. And don't worry, I won't go over all of those things again. You can watch that other live stream if you're interested to see what, if any, conclusions we came to or I came to. But today's video is going to focus on three specific comics that are great favorites of mine, have been favorites for a long time. And apart from why I think they're great, which is definitely going to be part of this live stream, I'd also like to touch upon a little bit of that underrated aspect. Do I think these are underrated comics? What does that actually mean? And it means different things, as we discussed last weekend, but each of these comics, I think, is underrated in a different way. And of course, it's all relative. So hopefully all of that will be part of what this live stream is going to be about. There's also no fixed time for these live streams. I think my shortest live stream has been 90 minutes. I think that is my record as far as the bottom part of it is concerned. No, maybe there's a 45-minute live stream, but the long live streams, there have been some pretty long ones. I don't know how long this is going to be, but I don't anticipate it being a very long one because, after all, there are only three comics to talk about. But there is so much to talk about, and depending on whether you have read one or any of these, one or all three of these comics, if you've read any of these things, I'd love to know your opinions on it. And in my videos, I try not to get into spoilers, and in my short edited videos, that's generally the case. I avoid spoilers because I don't like spoilers myself, and I talk about things in a very general way, which I hope is still rewarding to people who are familiar with the work and they can see what I'm saying and what I'm trying to hide as far as a spoiler while still talking about the work. That's not always possible. Sometimes, in order to talk about just how good or how bad maybe something is, you have to talk about the details of it. So when you're analyzing something or when you're discussing something, it's difficult to think about spoilers all the time if you want to talk about critique. So this is one of those difficult things, is do I want to have reviews? Do I want to have discussions? And of course, if you're talking about underrated comics, for whatever reason you're calling them underrated, chances are low that many people would have read them. Of course, much of what I do on this channel is to spotlight comics that I think more people should read. Everything, even if it is Bone, which is a best-selling, worldwide sensation, translated into multiple languages, millions and millions of copies sold. And I still think more people should read Bone, or I still think that people who haven't read Bone would really enjoy it if they gave it a shot. So how does one balance that aspect of wanting people to read stuff and not wanting to spoil things and wanting them to have that experience and also having a discussion? So I'm not quite sure how I'll resolve that in this live stream. And here's what I'm thinking, and I'll quickly check in the comments to see what you think of it. What I'm thinking is I'm going to talk about each three of these comics in a general sense of why they're great, what they're about, why I enjoy them, and then maybe loop back around and talk in a little bit more detail about each of those three, maybe take a particular aspect or maybe take a particular thing in each of these things and use that to talk about that underrated aspect of it. All of this is very nebulous. So that's why, in spite of thinking about this as an edited video for a long time, I did end up making that the topic of a live stream, because I thought maybe as I rambled and maybe as I contradicted myself and went round and round in circles, I'd get to some sort of a discussion point with all of you, something that I might not be able to do in an edited video. Let's see how it goes. So that's a quick introduction to what we're going to be doing, talking about three comics, talking about what makes them great, and talking about why they may be considered underrated, or why I'm thinking of the term underrated in a certain aspect for each of them. And I'll talk about those aspects and maybe talk a little bit in detail about those texts to sort of challenge or sort of reply to the reasons why something might be underrated. So that's the thing. Good to see other people have joined. Barry, good to see you. Samrat, good to see you. Gumby, good to see you. Dennis, good to see you. Great. So I could do both conversations. I will do both conversations. I'll do both of them in this live stream. But how long each part will take, well, that remains to be seen. So great to see everyone here. I think part 2 works too. Well, let's see. So again, I have talked, as I was saying, for 4 hours or very close to 4 hours on one live stream, but that was 65 comics. That was, I think, the Eisner Award game live stream. I've got a couple of different live streams on the Eisner Award game in which we take one category through the years and talk about the comics and whether we've read them and what we think of them if we've read them, something that a lot of other people were also doing. So I think for the best writer, either for the best writer or for the best writer artist, I can't remember which one, but it might have been non-fiction, fiction. I can't remember. There were 2 categories. And so therefore, for every award, there were 2. And it ended up being like 65 or 66 comics. And that was one for the history book. So this one with 3 comics is probably not going to go that far. Guido van der See, good to see you. Sleepy Reader, great to have you on board. Hello, hello. So to get started, as I said, I'm not going to recap everything that we talked about in the previous live stream, but when thinking about underrated comics, at the end of that live stream, I was talking about, well, this makes me think of the term hidden gems, and what do we mean by hidden gems, and I'd love to do a video on hidden gems. And someone said, you should do a video on hidden gems, and I had a couple of comics that sprang to mind immediately, and after that, I was drawing a blank. Everything I looked at, I was like, that's not a hidden gem. That's a gem. Everyone knows that's a gem. And even if it isn't everyone knows, and this is where I think all of us will understand this conundrum, if we talk about something famous and if we talk about something not famous, we can make relative pockets. And someone can be a superstar in one sphere, in one area. So therefore, can I truly say that, well, unless you're looking at box office or unless you're looking at earnings and numbers only, you can have a lot of people who are very highly rated. Just because millions and millions of people don't read them doesn't mean they're underrated. If everyone who reads them worships them, fewer people watch, I don't know, a Daniel Day-Lewis movie. It doesn't mean that the movie or the performance is somehow underrated. It could still be considered by some other people as an overrated thing. So this is one of those, again, I'm not going to get into that conversation, but I did want to think about the term underrated differently, but I was having trouble finding comics that I could actually classify as underrated. So the 3 comics that I'm going to talk about today are going to be underrated in different ways. And perhaps the most easily classifiable one is the category that I think the first comic of this evening falls into, because I'm talking about Bloody Chester, written by J.T. Petty and illustrated by Hilary Florido and published by First Second Comics in this slim paperback. And the reason why I think Bloody Chester is underrated, it's pretty easy. It's because most people haven't heard of it, or most people don't talk about it. I've not really seen it talked about or discussed very often. This is one of the second books I read. It's not the first. I think the second book that made me aware of the publisher. I was coming to it for different reasons. I was coming to it for the author. So I was coming, it's American Born Chinese by Jean Luen Yang. And I'd heard very good things about that book. When I read that book, and I enjoyed that book tremendously, I looked up what other things that publisher had, and they had quite a number of books. And over the years, they published many, many books. I have a decent sized shelf of First Second Comics, shelf number 3 in my shelf videos. And Bloody Chester is one of those earlier formative reads for me from First Second, but I don't really hear many people talking about it. I haven't read anything else by J.D. Petty or Hilary Florido, although the author notes over here tell me that they've worked in other things. J.D. Petty is apparently a writer in Hollywood as well, screenplays and TV. I think somewhere it mentioned that he had also worked in video games. He was on the writing team of the Splinter Cell video game. I don't know if I've heard of Splinter Cell. I've never played it. I don't know if it has a good story or if the writing is anything to commend it. But Bloody Chester, I haven't heard people talk about. So this is an easily thing. If this is a good book, if I enjoyed it and no one else, or I don't find many people, it's easy for me to call it it's easy for me to call it underrated. Another thing, and it's been a while, and I didn't want to go back and look at reviews online, but when I first read it, and over the years, I have tried to look up what other people think of it. Now, this is very, very unofficial, unscientific. There's no data. I basically look at Amazon reviews, and every now and then I go and look at Goodread reviews. I'm not very familiar with Goodread, but because of the viewers of this channel and the members of the Friends of FTLOC Discord, I've started spending more time on Goodread, usually reading reviews written by viewers of this channel, because a lot of people share their reviews online. Just because they're not making YouTube videos doesn't mean they're not talking about comics. So I've read more and more Goodread reviews, and I've gotten into this habit of reading something and then seeing what other people think about it. And the thing about Goodreads, and I guess Amazon as well, is that they employ a star and a scoring system, which aggregates and weights these votes. I don't know what the formula is. And because I don't assign number scores, and I don't think about things as 4 out of 5 or 3.5 out of 5, things like that, I have to then translate not just what someone's score means, but what the average of those scores means. These are all the caveats, because what I mean to say is, maybe when I've looked at the reviews, or when I've looked at just the score, the scoring system, etc., either, and this is going to be true for all of the books, one of the things that I'm thinking, like, how do I know it's underrated? I can go by anecdote. I don't hear many people talking about them. But then again, I don't talk to many people, so that's not big proof. You know, I'm not really out there in the community. I'm not really getting into book clubs and having discussions any greater than the ones that I have in the comment sections of YouTube. So other than that, I thought, well, let me see how many reviews a book has online, and how those reviews grade it. So either a small number of reviews, so even if it's 5 out of 5 stars, if only 5 people have rated the book, if 5 people have it seems to me, relative to other books, and this is where it becomes very shaky, it seems to me that that is a low number. So that's one way that something can be underrated. It's got fewer than you would expect, or fewer than its peers, or fewer than something else, maybe from the same publisher, maybe from the same author. That's one way of looking at it. And the other thing is, well, apart from the number of votes, what's the score? If the score, the average score, as it turns out to be, is not something that reflects accurately. Now, once again, this is weird, because if I don't use a number system, how do I know what it means? But if something says 3.5 out of 5, I can, without even having given a score to a book, I can say, well, it wasn't a 3.5. It was higher than that. Well, how high would it be, Anshuman? You may ask me. And I'm like, I don't know. I haven't given it, but it's higher than 3.5. All I can say is 3.5 out of 5 feels wrong. So these are the categories that I was thinking of. And also, another aspect that I decided to attach to this is that the books got to be have been around for a little while. So I don't want to talk about something that just came out 6 months ago, even, because reputation sometimes takes time to establish and things can be hyped up and a letdown. But for something that is great, something that is fantastic, maybe it takes a little bit of time. So I figured that 5 years should be okay. But I believe all three of these books are more than 10 years old. So I would say a decade is about long enough for something to establish a reputation. And if it isn't very well thought of when it comes out, it may have a recovery, its reputation may change. Once again, I'm not very familiar with the larger reputations of these works, so I'm really talking very, very anecdotally. So something that is at least 10 years old, something that either doesn't have the number of reviews you think it should have, or the reviews don't think as highly of it as you did when you read it. Those are my vague parameters for saying underrated. And then again, there'll be some relative things. So, Bloody Chester, the last I checked, and those of you who are watching this live and are online with other tabs, you can look this up for me. I don't think this had many reviews on Amazon. When I checked, maybe 5 reviews or 6 reviews. It did have more reviews on Goodreads and more ratings, but from what I remember, the rating wasn't very high, or at least I didn't think it was very high. This might have been a 3.5 out of 5. And that struck me as odd because Bloody Chester, in my opinion, is a terrific comic. No surprise here. I think all three of these comics that I'm going to talk about today, that I am talking about right now, are terrific comics. Bloody Chester is a terrific comic. So I would want it to be more well known, and I would be surprised if it wasn't well thought of by the people who have read it. That was my opinion when I finished it. This is a Western. It is a stark Western. It is a revisionist sort of Western. It's what I would consider a neo-Western, or a something along the lines of Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven or Deadwood, something that demythologizes the Western while still very much being part of that mythology or using that mythology in its storytelling. This is dirty, it's grimy, it's very down in the mud, very literally in the mud and the manure. The blood and the mud can't be separated. It is also quite a dark story. It's much darker than I thought it would be. And at the same time, it completely defies any kinds of expectations you may have of it. And that those expectations could be numerous, and some of them might be in spoiler territory. So maybe we'll get to it in the second part. But Bloody Chester is a bloody good read. It is. I love Westerns, but I don't think every Western I read or watch or play in a video game is fantastic. Just because it's a Western, it's not going to automatically appeal to me. I did have some expectations of it because I knew it was a Western. It looks like a Western. And when I started it, it quickly established me in the Western. It has very familiar Western tropes, including the coming of the railroad and the transformation of the Wild West and the encroaching civilization ending certain lawless things that we are familiar with. I think Deadwood has some of that. Red Dead Redemption games have some of that. And this is very much in that vein. However, this does not have a sprawling cast of characters. It's quite lean. It's quite spare. There are 6 characters in the whole story, and it's a desolate area. It's a ghost town, and only a few people remaining in the ghost town that our protagonist encounters. So in this setup, it achieves something in these very few pages that I think is extremely difficult to achieve. It achieves propulsive storytelling that is also a slow burn. So it's moving forward, but it's taking its time. As we move from scene to scene, we have a lot of time spent on the scene, and then we're at the next scene and a lot of time spent in the scene. So we're not rushing through the scenes themselves, but they keep the story moving and the locations moving beautifully. Even more important than that, Bloody Chester has fantastic characters. And I think it's easy for all of us to say, well, yes, characters are what matter most, characters are what's important. But what do we mean by character? And by character, I always think of someone who's believable as a person on page. It doesn't matter if it's genre fiction, if it doesn't matter if it's fantasy, it doesn't matter if they're an alien. Something about them has got to seem rounded, it's got to seem complete. And sometimes people will spend paragraphs and paragraphs, lines and lines, and not establish a complete character. And other people will be able to do it with just a few strokes of the pen or the brush. This is in that second category. It's a slim book. It's a sparse story. There are few characters, but each of them is indelible. Each of them sticks out as a particular individual person who is distinct as a human being within this larger society, which has whatever it forces you to do or whatever your compulsions are, whether they're to family, whether they're to wealth, whether they're to survival. It has those larger things, but the individual is defiant in the center of all of them. And that's not just our hero or our protagonist, because it's questionable whether he is a hero, perhaps. Each of the characters, the protagonist and everyone he encounters, is that way. They're complete, they are part of the world that they're in, but they maintain their own identity almost in defiance of that world, which for something this thin and so slight, and I put slight within quotation marks, is fantastic. And the other thing about the characters is that the lore and the exposition, which can be, especially in genre work, a very tiresome thing, is fantastically handled in this book, because they're given to you from the character's point of view. Any story that you hear, any history that you hear, any background information you get on other characters and what has happened, this is information that we as readers receive. But in Bloody Chester, each piece of information comes to us colored and subjectified by the person who's giving us that story. So this creates, there's no narration, there is only characters talking to each other, but this creates this unreliability in the middle of the lore giving, in the middle of the background. Like, okay, I know the railways are coming, I know there's this thing about the Pinkertons, I know there's that town, but how much is someone not telling me, the reader, because they're talking to another character, no one's talking to the reader? How much are they hiding? How much are they not telling me? And how much is a part of their bias and their worldview and their vested interests? So what is the truth and what is not the truth becomes a fundamental, central part of Bloody Chester, which is, at its core, a mystery. So a Western, dark, dirty mystery that in very few pages creates indelible characters who all propel the story and the narrative forward and give us, the readers, the background and the lore and the exposition that we need without ever making us feel burdened. It's a fantastic comic. So why haven't more people read it, or why don't more people talk about it? Or when people do talk about it, why do they not talk about it as highly as I think it should be? And that's a question that I'm not going to say that I have an absolute answer to, but I can put forward a couple of questions. Maybe it's this is what the way that I can go. So one, and the first reason I think, is the art style of Bloody Chester seems to have put off at least one or two readers that I have seen. This is in my opinion, in my view, I love this art style, but there's something about it that maybe makes people feel that this is a young reader's book. Maybe it's all ages work, although as soon as you start, you start with your hero throwing up after a night of drinking in a stable. He looks out across this town, which, talk about deadwood under snow, it's squalor, it's just ramshackle. And even from this very first panel, you can see this isn't a beautiful set designed western. This is mud and planks of wood. And with his horse, because he's at the stable, he goes into a bar and he orders breakfast, which is flapjacks and a bottle of whiskey, immediately gets into a fight, immediately gets the crap kicked out of him in an argument with someone at the bar, and then comes back, picks himself up, bleeding, covered in muck and mud and filth, and gets his breakfast, saying, well, he said he'd pay for my breakfast, before he beat him up. So from the very beginning, it's definitely not a kid's story. It's definitely not for children. It's quite violent and it's quite ugly, or it's at least showing us this ugly side of the Wild West from the very beginning. Our young looking protagonist and the art style, maybe the color scheme, and maybe an association of what other books First Second publishes. Although First Second publishes a number of young readers' books and all ages books, they really do publish books for adults and books that shouldn't be read by kids as well. But this may feel to people looking at it like a young adult graphic novel. Maybe the art style to me seems more close to a mix between, say, Matt Kint and Paul Pope, although not with the peculiarities of both of them. But this art style, this color scheme, the publisher, and the fact that it's a Western with what looks like a very young-faced protagonist, a young man, all of these things may create the impression that this is going to be a rollicking adventure story, whereas that is definitely not what it is. There is action, there is violence, there is physical melee violence, there is gunshot and very damaging gunshots. People die, people bleed, people suffer, people have disease, and people suffer over extended periods of time, just like Unforgiven and some of those other things I'm talking about. When someone gets shot, they don't die immediately, they bleed, and then they have an infection, and there's a larger plague and illness environment in which this story takes place. So all of these things are completely counter to the way that a superficial glance or an expectation along the lines of art style, etc., might bring up. That's one of my theories. Maybe that's what it is. I will say, though, that the art style and the colors and the expressions and the action portrayed in this style, with some very nifty comics panel work and layouts as well, all of this, and I'm not even getting into the writing right now, is fantastic and part of the reason why I like this comic so much. The subversive nature of it, I think, does end up marrying that dark storyline to this presentation with this kind of sketchy look, which creates a rug being pulled out from underneath our feet sort of sensation. I will say, however, The Bloody Chester is not an action-packed comic. It is not a galloping adventure. It has vistas, it has all of the things I was talking about, but it is a slow burn. It's a mystery, but it's not a murder mystery or a whodunit in the traditional sense. And I think that might be another reason why people don't think of this highly, because their expectations are for a Western or for a mystery of something weird going on and then the resolution from our hero. And this is not what the story is interested in. It doesn't mean there isn't a mystery. It doesn't mean there isn't a resolution to the mystery. And I think that the mystery and its resolution are just fantastic. They are superb because they take the texture of this environment. Like, why is this a Western? there will be no question in your mind when you finish this that I know why this is a Western. I know why this isn't a sci-fi story or something else. I mean, it could have been. You could make the story in anything, but why has this story been told as a Western? What does it have to do with manifest destiny? What does it have to do with incredible potential and failure? What does it have to do with the way a country or a society is made and at what cost? All these heavy weighty things come through in this tiny slim little book with with incredible minimalism. There is no lecturing. It's only, as I said, it's only dialogue between characters, and the dialogue itself will tell you what the world is like, what the people are like, what the impulses are. And from that, you as the reader create this larger story, this larger metaphor of what's being talked about, with no one in the comic ever preaching at you or standing for the good side or the right way of thinking, for the most, in a way that I find many much more famous works, much more celebrated works to fall quite short of. I find them to become manipulative, where this is just terrific storytelling. There are a couple of other things that I think also put people off about this book, but like with the art style and the color scheme, I think that those negative things are actually positives for this book. But I'm not going to talk about those in detail right now because they will include small spoilers. So for now, I'll move past Bloody Chester. Maybe we'll come back to it later. But that's my first book, Bloody Chester, written by J.T. Petty. Very well written by J.T. Petty and very well drawn by Hilary Florido, published by First Second. I think this was published in 2011 because I think I read it in 2011 or 2012 because I was looking for other First Second books, and it was a pretty new publication. But since then, I really haven't heard many people talk about it, which I think is a real pity. I don't know if this is out of print or still in print or if it's going to be reprinted, but if you ever see this book, if you find it used, if you find it in a yard sale or garage sale, you know, you people in in countries that have such means of getting books, if you can get your hands on this, I would highly, highly recommend it. And if you don't enjoy it, give it as a present to someone who likes subversive anti-Westerns and see what they think. All right, let's take a little break to look at if there are any questions for me. There's a lot of chat and there's a lot of conversation. If you have a question directly for me, tag me, and because it shows up with a blue bar, but I think you have to say @for the love of comics. I think last time people tried to tag me at FTLOC and it didn't highlight for me. It's listed as young adult on Amazon, Sleepy Reader says. That's I mean, I don't want to argue with that because I think young adults should read it. I don't think there's anything in it that young adults would not get a lot out of. But to keep it at young adult only, I think, is the real disservice. So I think that's where the underrating comes in. I think it's a very adult story. Adult doesn't have to be swearing, although there is swearing, and sex, although there is sexual references in this as well. You know, maybe in a safe-ish way for young adults. And obviously, I'm not saying young adults shouldn't read about sex, but because of the nature of the world and the violence, I would say this is an adult story. And I think the themes of the story, the motifs that we see that run through it, even in these few pages, are heavy and they are dense, and they've been sprinkled through this book with such lightness that they never weigh you down. It's when you get to the end of it, you're like, I see now the whole picture. And that's the kind of stuff that I think larger, ambitious works that span centuries and have costs of dozens of people, it's usually their domain. They're going to talk about generations. They're going to talk about land and how a country transforms and things like that. It's not going to be 1 week or 4 days in one small little ghost town in the Wild West. That's not going to be the thing that tells you about America. But I think it does. And I think that is why I find this book to be so underrated. And I think if you read that from that point of view, and I don't think it's something I'm reading into it, which is where we'll get into in the spoiler territory area. Do you play much video games? I do play video games, actually. I don't play as many as I used to when I was in college and even when I was single. But I've lately gotten my wife to play video games as well, which means that I get to play more video games as well. Um, let's see, any other questions? It's not on Hoopla, but Rick Ray says no first second books are on Hoopla. Oh, that's unfortunate. Um, anything. What to read if I love Monster and Billy Bat? I didn't quite enjoy the first volume of Monster, but I think Pluto is fantastic. So if you like Urasawa's Monster, I think Pluto's got a very good chance of working for you as well, although one can never be sure. Um, young adult marketing hurt its success? Maybe, and I sometimes do get that. I think with First Second in particular, because even if you go to their website, they'll have these things sectioned off and they'll say young readers, young adult. And while that's great for people who are looking for stuff to buy for their kids, and it's good to keep them separated in that way, I think that young adult marketing does hurt some works. I think there's a lot of young adult work that is just copy and pasting and with diminishing returns of things that are great and successful and happen to be great and successful with young adults. But the truly original works and the great works, I think they transcend that sort of marketing thing, and that marketing ends up being something that hurts them. I think that's definitely possible. Um, all right, there don't seem to be the Western comic, The Smell of Starving Boys. I'm not sure. I haven't read The Smell of Starving Boys. I will say, though, that Bloody Chester does put itself forward. No, I'll say this for the I'll say this for the spoilers section, but it's not quite the same as some other Stark westerns I have seen, although it can fit very well into them. I think the young and youngish protagonist part of it is part of that, where if you see that, then you're thinking Young Guns or Young Guns 2 type of thing. It's not quite that. It's so the Billy the Kid, who's truly a kid or a very young kid or a very young man without necessarily the legend. In fact, the legend of Bloody Chester is also a very interesting thing about this book, is that his name is Bloody Chester and people give him a lot of respect, and then they find out why his name is Bloody Chester, and that respect goes away, and it's all in that one name. It's all in that bloody, and that itself, that just starts the book, but that has resonance throughout the book of what name you give something and how that name makes a difference, and how much what you say and what stories you tell become truth. How did you find Bloody Chester myself? Oh, me. I bought this. I think there's a date on it over here. Yeah, I think I bought this in 2012 or 2013. Yeah, it says 2013. So I think it came out in 2012. So I just bought it when it was new. When I was buying interesting looking books from First Second, if that's what you meant by how did I find it. Otherwise, how did I find it? Well, that's what I've been talking about. Yeah, I don't think the term young adult is doing books any favors, and I don't think it's doing this book any favor if it got classified as young adult. Just because, anyway, I think it's a fantastic comic, and I'll get into more reasons why a little down the road. My second book for today. A comics dude wants to know about video games. I'll do an entire different thing on video games. Every now and then I think I do a live stream which has no comics value, but then I think, no, I don't want to do that. But video games, I mean, I don't really play that many, and I've only played a few throughout my life, but they've been very important to me, and they ended up being fantastic video games to have been the only one I played. So there was a time when I didn't play anything other than, role-playing games and all that stuff, and I only played one shooter shooter, and that shooter way back on the GameCube was Resident Evil 4, and I love Resident Evil 4. I still don't like shooters, but I still love Resident Evil 4. Not really sure. But anyway, that's so much for that digression. What made me pick it up when it came out? Mainly, Sleepy Reader. I picked it up because it was published by First Second. Two, because it was a Western. Three, because the cover looked good because it works with Bloody Chester, this red cover. And four, because I think I saw the first couple of pages and I like the fact that he was waking up in a stable and throwing up and hungover and squalid down. I was like, okay, those are two good pages. There's a richness to squalor and the ways of looking at these communities that, when done well, I really like. And I think this is spare and lean. Something like Pat Grunt's excellent comic The Grot does it in a much more substantial manner, where everything has something to look at. Every page, every panel is giving you world building. This is a lot more bleak, and I mean, that's bleak as well, but it almost seems to be bacterial growth, human society. Over here, human society gone, plague, ghost town, burn into the ground so the railroad can get through. It's those kind of things that really appealed to me right at the beginning. A lot to do with the Western genre, a lot to do with First Second on the cover. Don't judge a book by its cover. And here's the interesting thing, and this might be the last thing I say about this. This cover gives the impression that this is a horror comic. And I wouldn't say it's not. But I think anyone expecting a horror comic, and this is 2012, so this is before, the Red Dead Redemption with zombies and things like that. If you're expecting zombies and Western, I can see why this wouldn't satisfy you. And if you're expecting a particular kind of horror story, I can see why this wouldn't. But there are people who will argue that one of the greatest horror movies is Rosemary's Baby. And I've met people who say, no, that's not a horror movie. They've got a very peculiar, or I wouldn't say peculiar, they've got a very fixed idea of what horror is. And I once remember reading a list of the top 100 horror movies of all time. I may have told the story before. Anyway, on the list, they had, somewhere in the 40s or 50s, they had Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, and George Segal, because they called it the greatest domestic horror movie ever made. And I can understand why they put it there. I think it's a little tongue-in-cheek and I think it's a joke, but it wasn't number 100 or something like that. It was in the 50s or 40s as one of the greatest horror movies ever made. Now, I'm not going to go that far. I'm not going to say Revolutionary Road is as a horror movie, but if you're expecting horror and if you're expecting a certain type of horror and then you read Bloody Chester with those expectations, I can see why you'd be let down. But this, I think, is one of those things about underrated. Why is that a 3.5? Why did that person, or why did those people give it a 2 out of 5 or a 1 out of 5? And they're like, I was expecting this and I didn't get that. That seems to be the reason why that score is low. And that's the definition of underrated. The rating needs to be much higher because it's such a good story. Because you were expecting, if you're expecting Saving Private Ryan and you watch, I don't know, The Thin Red Line, you're going to have to deal with your expectations before you're actually able to deal with the movie. And I think that's completely natural. And that's part of what came up in our conversation last week. How much does your expectation lead to something being overrated or underrated? So I'm trying to get over that. And I'm trying to say, beyond my expectations, beyond other people's expectations, this story is a great story. It's a slow burn. It's weird, it's odd, it's interestingly paced, it's got bizarre characters, and they are all complete. They all are consistent. And that's the thing that makes it great. And that's the thing that makes good writing and good stories great. And that's why even the others that we're talking about will have something in common with Bloody Chester, and Bloody Chester will have with them, in spite of them being very, very different and very at first glance, absolutely nothing could be further from Bloody Chester than A Taste of Chlorine by Bastien. And I used to pronounce Bastien Vives, but I realized the accent goes the other way, so I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and I should have looked it up at this point of time, but well, there you go. A Taste of Chlorine by Bastien Vives, I think, was published. This is a Jonathan Cape edition. I don't know if it was published by a different publisher in the United States. I know that Drawn and Quarterly and Jonathan Cape very often share books, or is it Faber? I always get confused about this. But this was 2011. So, yes, that definitely crosses our 10-year limit. It's been around for 10 years. And A Taste of Chlorine, another slim little book, is a slice of life story that takes place almost exclusively at various days in a public swimming pool. Our hero, our protagonist, is a young man with a bent spine, with a curvature of the spine, who's advised to go swimming to help his back. He goes swimming, and it's all about a woman who also swims at that pool. And this is a magnificent book that is almost completely silent as far as the words are concerned. There are many, many silent panels. Much of this book might feel like a silent book. So you will have the initial conversation at the chiropractors, at the doctors. And even that, this isn't soliloquies over here. And then you've got the swimming pool. And the presentation of this space, of this public swimming pool, is just gorgeous, and one of the primary reasons why I hold this book so highly. It creates a real sense through different kinds of use of the panel structure, the layouts, the where you get the full page, the three quarters, the placement of it, to create the sense of this community space that is almost completely tinged in the blue of the water, of the swimming pool reflecting, and the people who share this pool. And then his encounters, him awkward in his first few days over there, him getting more used to it, and then observing the people around him, watching the people around him. And you can see very little text, and all done through shape and movement, and the eyes looking and the faces looking and glancing at each other. And he meets this woman. Very interestingly, I think there's this attraction that he feels for her. But again, there's no text. So what are you reading? Where are you getting this attraction? What can he really see of her? It's interesting to me that her hair is in a swim cap. Her eyes are behind goggles. And she's got this sort of nondescript, but it's her body, her figure, her movements. This is one of those great panels. Let me see if I can pull this into focus for you. There you go. It's all of this is just wordlessly conveyed to us moment by moment, and then day after day. I think he swims on Wednesdays, or he swims twice a week. And then the anticipation of waiting for her, of looking for her when he gets to the pool, of getting to the pool late one day and being worried that he's missed her, of watching her walk away. Then he eventually does get to talk to her. They start a conversation. And the entire story is not quite a romance. It never gets there. It's just about two people who meet and share this space, share these moments briefly, and then it's over. The book is perhaps one of the most gentle love stories I've ever seen, because it's not quite a love story. It's there you don't get any consummation, but you just have moments. You do have laughter, you do have some smiles, but it's really about that anticipation. It's about meeting someone and not knowing who they are, and being drawn to them and being attracted to them and not knowing why. And then every single thing just sort of adding to that myth of the thing that you have built in your head. Now, this would be almost unbearably saccharine or sticky if it wasn't so wordless. because all of these things are being conveyed by the angles, by the spaces, and you, the reader, I am the one who's writing this love story. I'm the one who's trying to create, whether it's only a physical lust or whether it's an enigmatic thing. When his friend comes to the pool, on his request, his friend comes to the pool and then strikes up a conversation with the girl. We can feel the betrayal, we can feel the pain, we know what's going on over here. It is poetically and cinematically executed, all in this one pool, as I was saying, and it remains a striking story. And over here, there's a different kind of question, I think, about what do we mean by underrated. Is there is there a is there a bad review of this out there? I mean, there might be, and I think this is one of those things where I think it's more contextual. Bastien Vives, I'm not I'm not sure, but I think gets talked about a lot for his other works. And this is, I think, one of those relative underrated. A Taste of Chlorine is definitely a fantastic work, and I think, and I'm not sure, and those of you who can look it up online will let me know. I think it's got pretty good reviews. I don't think it has as many reviews as it should, and so it's the same kind of thing. But I do think that Bastien Vives and Taste of Chlorine are much more well known than, at least in my experience, Bloody Chester is. But I think with Vives, Paulina is the big book that many people talk about from what I've seen. It is definitely a much bigger book. It is more ambitious. It's more polished in certain ways. It definitely has, as far as time and characters and the complexity of the relationships are concerned, about a young girl and her ballet teacher. It has a lot more significance worn on its sleeve. And I think in later works, other things that I know Bastien Vives for, I really liked Last Man, the comic that was being brought out by First Second, and then it stopped. And I think Robert Kirkman is now going to bring it out in its entirety, which means that I bought 9 volumes of tankobon-sized first, second paperbacks for nothing, because I'm going to have to start from the beginning with this. But that's not the point. The point is Last Man was a good comic. Earl Grey, of course, has done a video on some of the couple of the more latter-day Bastien Vives comics, and I'd recommend you check them out. So there's The Grand Odalisque, there's A Sister. There are other books that I haven't yet gotten to, but for controversy reasons and non-controversial reasons, I don't hear a lot of people talking about A Taste of Chlorine as much as I hear them talk about his other works. And I think that's what makes it underrated for me, where it comes across, when I talk to people who have read this and other works, it comes across from some people that Taste of Chlorine is a good little one-act play. It's not the 3-act thing that he would do in this work. It doesn't have that vision. It doesn't have that ambition. It's a writer finding their feet and getting used to things and experimenting with things that they will do much better in later works. And that is the thing that I will have to disagree with all due respect, because I think this is a fully formed work. I think it is superb. I think it's polished. And I think it is deep and meaningful, and it understands these things that we're talking about: attraction and strangers and being shy and connecting with people and community spaces and areas that you occupy at the same time, and whether you're together or not, the intimacy of changing rooms and pools and swimsuits and everyone walking around wet. All of these things are given to you in pictures, in layouts, in pages, and with very, very few words. And it creates, once again, a complete world. It creates, even without speaking characters, it creates a sense of completeness. I wouldn't say they're complete characters, because we don't really know much about them apart from them at the pool together, but it creates this world in which longing and connection and fleetingness is all right next to each other and compressed into everyday life in a way that we may not examine unless we are forced to, or we find ourselves unable to do anything different. It's that kind of vision of life that I think Taste of Chlorine in its small little stage, and it is a one act play, but it's a one act play with such passion and with such clarity in its observation of human beings, and it is able to create such longing that it is able to transport us into the skin of the protagonist, which I think is a fantastic feat for any writer to pull off. Where, as I was saying, you know what's going through this character's head, and you're not knowing this because there's an actor acting it out for you. You're not putting because there's voiceover or a panel or a thought bubble or anything like that. You're just getting it because you have been there for the 5 or 6 pages before that of this guy watching this girl, of them sharing this pool. And so when his friend talks to her, that feeling is something that I don't think anyone could miss, and it's been engineered by the author. So I think it's a fantastic work, and it deserves, I think, to stand equal to anything else that this creator has done. All right, another little water break. Let me see if we've got any questions. Hi, I like comics, Steve 1000. We all do. Good, you're at the right place. In Her Eyes is also great. I have not read In Her Eyes, but I've heard good things about Bastien Vives's In Her Eyes. So, yeah, once again, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that Bastien Vives is an unknown and no one talks about him and things like that. Of course not. He's a very famous person, and he's very, again, it's all relative, because there'll be a number of people who've never heard of him, who've never read anything by him, and that's because the people who read these comics and the people who read those comics don't read each other's comics. I don't know what that is, but fame is relative. So unless we're talking about like an absolute superstar that everybody in the world knows, and even then, I know people who will not know someone you think that everyone knows. So it is relative, but yes, he's a famous person. His works are famous. His arguments and conversations are famous. His interviews are famous. He's a very well known person. I just think over here, I'm not talking about Taste of Chlorine, a Taste of Chlorine being underrated in the way that I was talking about Bloody Chester being underrated, which is no one talks about it, or no one's heard of it, or no one's seen. It's more like this doesn't get talked about the way other works by the same creator get talked about. And the reason why it's not considered as great, or there seems to be that conversation in a couple of things that I've seen. The reason why it seems to be is something that I don't agree with. I think it is a full book, and I think in spite of its brevity and in spite of its leanness, it is absolutely poetic and extremely effective, because the craft is fully applied in getting that place created, in getting it populated with these players, and giving us this thing unfolds in front of our eyes with no clarity problems at our end as readers, which I think is marvelous work, is a marvelous achievement in storytelling. Well, see, the Comic Binge says, well, I don't know anyone in here, and don't worry about it, Comic Binge. And this is my point, is that, again, when I say underrated, overrated, this is also relative. So Taste of Chlorine, most things that I've read by Bastien Vives, but as we were saying, I haven't read everything. Most things I've read by him are terrific, are fantastic human examinations, but the leanness and the beauty and the elegance of A Taste of Chlorine make it a true gem. You know, it's this tiny little thing, but it's almost perfect, and it's so brilliant and it's so bright, that I really wish that more people would talk about this, more people would read this, and more people would hold it in the same esteem that they seem to hold other works by the same creator. Any questions? Ablaze has been bringing, yes, I think the most recent book of his that I got just a couple of weeks ago is published by Ablaze. I remember seeing that on the cover. There might be more coming down the pipeline. I wonder if they're going to reprint this. Once again, this is from Jonathan Cape, so I don't know what it was in the US. if you can find a review of Taste of Chlorine in the Guardian, well, yeah. Oh, well, first of all, was it a positive review? The other thing is, not everyone reads the Guardian, but yes, you understand my point. When we look at the entire body of work, do you think this talk about Sleepy Reader says, do you think this talk about hidden gems and underrated books will make you read new to you comics differently, wondering if they are hidden or underrated? It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think if you are going to make videos, and if you do make videos or write a blog, if you do it regularly, I think there is an expectation that you're going to talk about what you've read. And then after a while, you'll have that expectation that, oh, now that I'm reading this, I'm going to have to talk about it. Now, whether it's underrated, overrated, hidden gem, etc., that's the next level. But the fact that you're reading something and thinking about the fact that you're going to have to talk about it, I think is a thing that any of us who do this at even a semi-regular basis have to sort of contend with. I think one of the reasons why I don't talk about as many new comics is because I like to let them sit. And I'm talking about things that I read 10 years ago. For the first time I read them was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and things like that, is because I want to sort of simmer in it, and I want to see if it holds up, and I want to see if it maintains its grip on me, rather than me being on a fizzy high from a particular experience that'll fade very soon. So maybe one way of mitigating the thing that you're talking about is not to think about it from the point of view, oh, I'm reading this, I'm going to have to talk about this. Like, I don't have to talk about it right now. I have years and years of reading to talk about still. I'll get to this when I'll get to it, or maybe I'll read it again before I talk about it. So I think that's a good way of mitigating it. At least for me, it is. He's also famous for Last Man, yeah, the one I was talking about. He's got a bunch of people that he's. Last Man was a great comic. I couldn't, I bought each one of those volumes. I'm not very up on getting the latest, so I think I missed the first volume, so I bought volume 1 and volume 2 together, and that's all that was out. And as soon as the next volume was available, all the way to volume 7 in those little digest tankobon sized comics, I thought it was a great comic. A lot of fun, adventure, and twisting, but it never continued. So I'm sort of stuck in the middle right now, waiting for Robert Kirkman to come to my rescue. Gore Vidal, good to see you, sir. Says local shops don't carry European trades of any kind. Oh, that's unfortunate. Our chain bookstores are just a handful. Manga, on the other hand, is prevalent. The European trades problem, I think, is going to be one that most, if you have problems in the US, I mean, imagine what kind of problems we have in India, as in trying to get something that to made available, which is why I appreciate American publishers like Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly, who bring out American reprints of European material, usually with translations as well. They've got that presence, or they've got the print run, or they've got the distribution, not just in the United States, but that's what ends up. So for those of you who watch this channel, you would have seen that many of my European comics are actually US editions of European comics, because that's the only way that I get my hands on an English translation and an edition that I can read and have on my shelves. The European English language translations either don't seem to be a priority, and that's fine. I mean, you've got a huge market in the languages outside of English, and that's what's being catered to. But if they are translated within Europe, they don't seem to have an international presence or availability. So I end up relying on Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly, Ablaze, NBM, Magnetic Press, a number of these publishers to bring out the European comics in English, and then I can see what everyone is talking about, or I can try them out for myself. Cinebooks is an interesting publisher because they've got so many lower priced paperback books, but their translations are, I have mixed reactions to their translations. I don't have anything to compare them to, but there's something about that. You can't underestimate a good translation. So I particularly enjoy the fact that I know his name, Helge Daschler. Helge Daschler, who does a number of translations for Drawn and Quarterly. I've come to rely on that name giving me as much surety as any of the others in the credits over there. Tina says the Taste of Chlorine is evocative, a little bit like Taniguchi. Yes, a bit like Taniguchi. It's a little bit more formed, maybe. I think Taniguchi is really, but yes, absolutely. In one of my live streams, just when I was signing off, someone had a question for me, and I just saw it just as I hit disconnect. But the question was, any comics that feel like the movies of Wong Kar-wai? And I thought that was a great question. So I would have to say that A Taste of Chlorine was the first one. I thought it's not, you're not going to have one comic that's going to be like a Wong Kar-wai movie, but I did think of A Taste of Chlorine. It's got shades of In the Mood for Love. If In the Mood for Love was a short film, it could be very close to Taste of Chlorine in a very different way. Of course, I'm not talking about the cultural aspects and the larger story context. Just the idea of fleeting encounters, silences, glances, and longing existing under the surface, just under the surface, is, I think, quite similar as well. Yeah, availability. I mean, which is why I can never, even though I don't read digitally myself, I can never ever not praise digital comics for at least making things available. The idea that out of print can be a thing that no longer exists is one of the greatest things, I think, for readers. So it's unfortunate, but I'm hoping that the things are more digitized, at least, if not published and made available better than they are right now. Yes, it's hard to replicate In the Mood for Love, Gore Vidal. Yes, I don't think of it as a replication. I was just like, when someone asked me that question, In the Mood for Love was the first movie I thought of, and Taste of Chlorine was the first comic I thought. It was just that kind of association. It's like one of those things when people said best fantasy comic, the first thing I had originally thought of was Mouse Guard. And I said this in my Mouse Guard video. Oops, I've lost a headset. Actually, you know what? I don't need this anymore. I remember that I thought of Mouse Guard as the first thing, but then Mouse Guard doesn't have any magic in it, and I thought, well, my top 10 fantasy comics need to have magic, and the magic is what will make it fantasy. So just because you got to draw the line somewhere. So it's the first thing I think of, not necessarily the right thing in all of the analogies and matching it up, but I think if you like that kind of thing, if you like that kind of storytelling, you might respond well to the storytelling of A Taste of Chlorine. And the third book and the third comic on my list is very similar insofar as why I'm calling it. It's a great comic, and I'll tell you why I think it's a great comic, but it's also similar to A Taste of Chlorine from the point of view of how well it's known within the relative oeuvre of that author's work. And this is Wimbledon Green, the greatest comic collector in the world, by Seth. And just as a brief note, I'd mentioned this in a couple of other videos or live streams, and maybe even in a discussion with some of the people who are in the chat over here. Look at this little band. This is the band that contains the blurb and the ISBN and the price information. I don't know if you'll be able to see it over there, but right at the bottom, there is a note saying the author would like you to abandon this band when you buy this book, because this is not part of the design, and Seth designs all of his books as well. In fact, he designs other books as well. So a little bit about Canadian writer-artist Seth, one of my favorites, fantastic writer-artist, probably most famous for the sort of bookended. You've got It's a Good Life, If You Don't Weaken, probably his first graphic novel length work. And then you have most recently being several years ago now, the many years in the making, Clyde Fans. This is Clyde Fans book 1. It was later completed, and there's a big fat full edition of Clyde Fans out there. But both Clyde fans, which is his most recent work, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, one of his earliest works, they were all published originally in his comic book series, Palookaville. Palookaville is something that ran in this paperback, in this paper stapled form till issue 20 or 21, and then switched to hardcover, like an annual hardcover, which is Seth's comic book. So the early issues the early issues had autobiographical. I don't know if I need a video on Seth, I think. So the earlier issues had autobiographical stories. The longer story, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, I think started from issue 3 or issue 4. But just like these other works, just like, oh well, let me show you a little bit of Seth's art style. This lovely thick lines, duo colors, usually a duotone sort of wash, so black lines and then ink wash or ink fill in either blue or orange or green, things like that. Superb letterer, superb calligraphy. In fact, I think Seth is a very underrated, and again, why call someone who's so well known and so highly praised and such a art darling? How can you call him underrated? Just because I think more people should read him, more people should read his comics and read his works. But within this oeuvre of work coming through in Palookaville, oh, and also he's a designer, so I didn't get. He's done a lot of work for Drawn and Quarterly, who also publish his works. In fact, he is the person who's put together the John Stanley Library. So he's curated as well as designed these really lovely, lovely books. These lovely hardcover books. And Melvin Monster Volume 1, I think, might have been one of the first recent reads and new acquisitions videos I made 4 or 5 years ago. There's the Nancy books again, and of course the design of the Peanuts, the complete Peanuts box sets, the ones with the 2 volumes in every box. That's all set. So he's a big name, and he is very well known, and he's very renowned. And Clyde fans in particular, this massive meditation on loss and nostalgia that was, I don't know, like 12 years in the making. At least it seemed that way, reading them in Palookaville, reading each chapter coming out so slowly. That is considered by many people, and I think very obviously, his magnum opus, his pièce de résistance. And It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken still sort of holds up with its sly trickery and it blurring the lines between reality and fiction. But in my opinion, poor Wimbledon Green, gets kind of a little left behind. And I'm not so sure if that's true in sales, because I think this is still in print and I think it's still available. And it's been available ever since I got it. And I got it in, have I written down? I think it's 2010 is when I read this book. And I think it was published in 2005 or 2006. So it's been around for quite a while. I believe it's still in print, but it just doesn't get as much respect as Clyde fans or It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken and other, other stories and things published in Palookaville. And I wonder why. I think this is probably my favorite Seth work, although that's a tough call, because I love almost everything that he has done in various ways or the other. But Wimbledon Green, the greatest comic book collector in the world, may have been hurt by the fact that it is an outright comedy or it's a mockumentary. It is very much in the style of a Christopher Guest movie or Spinal Tap. You've got talking heads and people talking at length or briefly about this character, Wimbledon Green. Who was he? Where did he come from? Where did he go? And there is a larger mystery to where he went, but that's not really what the book is about. The book is about comic book collectors, particularly in the 1990s, apparently a huge number of, I don't even know, millionaire comic book collectors who are only interested in particular golden age things of mint and near mint condition comics selling for thousands and thousands of dollars, and people who bid in auctions against each other and have rivalries and have agents out there looking for things for them and trying to source them. And the fact that it is such a unbridled takedown of a particular kind of culture might have made it sound like it was way too niche and way too inside baseball and way too jokey about things that people didn't want to joke about. Maybe, but one of the first things about Wimbledon Green that I would like to say is that this, in spite of being an absolute mockumentary satire, is also extremely warm-hearted and embracing of the people that it is satirizing. And that is, I think, very, very subtly done. There is a lot in this that is very funny. There's a lot in this that is extremely cringy, but everything about Seth, the art style, the colors, the lettering, it's steeped in nostalgia. And Seth himself, if you read his comics, is an extremely nostalgic person. He thinks he was born at the wrong time because he has got autobiographical comics out there. And he yearns for a time that he has never known, and that he never lived through himself. And he wants certain kinds of clothes and he wants certain kinds of objects. And this is full of people like him. In fact, the author of Seth does appear as one of the worst characters in this. He's a charlatan, and he's a hoax, and he's a thief, and he's stolen comics from people. But there is a larger question, and he's just one of the many people that this comic talks about, this Canadian conglomerate of millionaires. And all of these comics that they're talking about are fake comics. These don't really exist. However, they also talk about Gold Key, they talk about Charlton, they talk about other things, Dell, that do exist. And they talk about other characters that do exist. They even have, in some of these interviews that are just made up people, they will have some real people, like an owner of the Beguiling bookshop in Canada, which is a real place, and I'm guessing is a real person. So mixing of those real people with this absolute fiction creates this unique pocket universe, very, very next to ours, in which there were all of these golden age comics that no one knows about except for these millionaires, and it's their life's ambition to try to outbid from each other these treasures and try all kinds of methods to come out on top. And in doing so, it serves as a wonderful little examination of the pettiest sides of people and the most oblivious and the most self-indulgent and wrapped up parts of people, all through collecting mint condition golden age comics. But there are a couple of things in this book, primarily the character of Wimbledon Green himself, a man coated in mystery who speaks with such education and such diction. And when he talks about comics, and when he talks about rare comics, or when he talks about artists and writers that other people don't care for, the way he talks about them makes other people want to collect them, even if they don't like those comics, because once Wimbledon Green has said this about it, then you must look into this person. He's a very interesting character, and there are a couple of people who say he's a fake and they know who he really is, and he used to be this pimply, overweight kid, and he hustled and he drove all around the country and picked up comic books from barns and flea markets and made his collection that way. Others say that he stumbled upon a fantastic comics collection that he cheated the original owner out of. He denies that, and he gives a version of his story. And one thing about this book is nothing matches. Different people's opinions, and even Wimbledon Green's stories about himself and other people's theories about him, they contradict each other all the time. And yet there are pockets that you can, as a reader, start filling them in. So every individual page almost will be a separate story or a separate adventure. And then every now and then you will get a really long story running maybe 4, 5, maybe even 6 pages. But most of them are single page, maybe even less than half a page. Some of them are just one strip at the bottom, very reminiscent of Chris Ware's comics in certain ways. And also the Seth book that this most closely resembles is George Sprott, which is another biography of a weird, strange person told through multiple talking heads as well as their own words. And just like George Sprott, this creates this collage, this mosaic of who this person was. And this story right here of him discovering, someone calls him, sees his ad in the newspaper, says, I've got a bunch of comics over here. He starts looking through the comics. Then there's some Dells, there's some Charlton. These are unappetizing. He shows him some novellas, some pulp books. And he says, oh, there are some more in that room over there. And he sees the room is full of suitcases. And he opens one suitcase. And I'll read you this part where he opens this first suitcase. I snapped open the locks on the first suitcase. There have been other great finds in my career. At each of them, I was shaking like a leaf with anticipation and collector's avarice. This was not so on that remarkable day. Dust flew as I raised the lid, and now the color shifts to this gold as this suitcase opens, and he sees within it 3 careful stacks. Each stack had was about 30 comics deep. Instantly, I identified the comics sitting atop each stack. On the left, the ultra rare Pow #1. In the middle, the 10th issue of Tin Pan Teddy. And on the right, the never before seen first issue of Liberty Lass. At this moment, it doesn't matter. At this moment, it doesn't matter whether you are a comics collector, whether you're Seth has created this excitement of finding in plastic bags, 1930s, mint condition, #1, never seen before. Just this comic was just reputed to have existed. No one had ever seen a print copy of that. That comic is there. And he has just found a room full of suitcases because this man used to own a drugstore, and he would read a comic and he would enjoy it, and he would then put it away in a sleeve. Since the 1930s, and now in 1990, as an old man, 90-something man, he's looking to sell all of these things. The discovery of this treasure, the idea of how much it's worth, and why is it worth this much? Because of all the other people who agree with you and say it's worth that much. This is so intoxicating, and over again throughout this comic, just when you think the satire has really gotten to you and you dislike all these people, you dislike all the way that they do, it's never that way. You're always excited about what they're going to do. You're excited about the auctions. You're excited about the backstabbing. It becomes this kind of thrill ride about something so silly and something given so much seriousness with people and their hermetically sealed underground chambers. The James Bond levels that these comics collectors go to fight each other and to collaborate with each other is ridiculous. It's very funny. And I think somewhere maybe that's part of why this book is not looked upon that highly. Again, I'm not sure if it is or isn't. It seems to me is that because it's comic, because it's funny, how much can it actually mean? How serious can it be? Look at Clyde fans. That's not funny. It's just somber and it's sad and it's about loss. And I think that as mature and as complex a work as Clyde fans is, I think Wimbledon Green has all of those themes, just the themes of loss, the themes of getting involved in things that aren't where your heart truly lies, the feeling of an imposter. It's not as epic. It's not as tragic. It's funny, and somehow funny means it's not as smart. I don't know why. It's not as dramatic. It's not as meaningful. It's not as deep. And that's where I have my big issues with that kind of criticism. I don't think this book itself does a lot to sell itself. First of all, it says a story from the sketchbook of the cartoonist Seth, and it says Seth in quotation marks. It's not really treating this book. If I look at, and this might be about when things are published. If I look at It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, a picture novella by Seth. All right. I mean, so it's got that little antiquity sort of retro presentation, which makes sense. But this is just straight up. Now, this whole idea of a story from the sketchbook of the cartoonist Seth, it's a pen name. It's a little removed. It says from the sketchbook. That itself is a little off-putting to some people, where they don't realize that this isn't just a series of sketches or things that were practice pieces. This is a fully fleshed out, fully finished book. And the idea being that this, coming from the sketchbook, what it really means is it wasn't in Palookaville. So if you got every copy of Palookaville, every issue of Palookaville, you would get It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken over 5 or 6 chapters. And you would get Clyde Fans over 20, I don't know how many chapters, but you wouldn't get Wimbledon Green. And you wouldn't also get the sequel / spin-off, the GNBCC, the Great Canadian Cartoonists, the Great Brotherhood of Northern Canadian Cartoonists, which was the sequel. And it's sort of about the other people, the other collectors other than Wimbledon Green in this. But the fact that it's funny actually hides the fact that it's actually quite sad as well, and the fact that it's tragic. It's just about a man and a man's loss, and that loss can be seen as a comic book collection, it can be seen as a reputation, it could be seen as a simpler, easier life that he never knew. But a billionaire, or must be, to afford the kind of things that he does, where does the money come from? Where did he come from? You know, how can a collector appear out of nowhere? How can he have such good taste? How can he have such great comics? That larger mystery, that curiosity, as I said, this book, I think, explodes so much of the pettiness of human beings and the avarice, as it says, the collector's avarice. And therefore, it speaks to larger things than just comic book collecting. The joke is just a vehicle, I think, for looking at all kinds of behavior. And I think part of the laughing at these characters includes a little bit of cringing, not only at them, but ourselves, if we recognize anything. And there are so many types of people, and there are so many ways of looking at it, that even when you have the commonsensical guy who dismisses all of this as absolute nonsense, they don't necessarily come across as a person you want to be. They don't come across as the person who you want to be representing your voice over there. You want to be part of these dreamers and these nonsensical people, even if all of their behavior isn't that admirable. And I think that complexity of making something that does make you laugh, that does make you laugh at somebody else, that does satirize something, but also makes what they're talking about so warm and so inviting and so alluring, even if it's alluring for exactly the same reasons that you are, exactly the reasons why they deserve satire. The same thing that you criticize is the thing that attracts you. And I think that has almost never been done better than in Wimbledon Green. There are books that I read that make me feel hungry and that I want to go and eat. There are books that I read that make me want to go read other books. There are books that I read that make me want to do things that those books are doing. And most of the time, I think I've seen this with some comics that had to do with Dungeons and Dragons and with D&D role-playing, tabletop role-playing in particular, which I really like. And again, talking about computer games, I really liked RPG systems in games. So there were some comics that I read that they made me want to play the games that they were talking about, I wanted to have that level up and that progression. I wanted to get a new, it created that itch in my brain. And this comic, Wimbledon Green, makes you want to browse your shelves, makes you want to bag and board comics. There's a thing where his butler talks about his daily routine. And I'm not going to lie, it sounded like a fantastic routine. I'm like, that's what I want to do. Wake up and have this humongous breakfast and then go for a little walk and then retire to my library for a couple of hours so I can check out 2 or 3 different things. First, he goes to his catalog to find out where his comics are. Then he gets these comics out and then he takes notes and he reads them and he takes more notes throughout the day. Then he comes for lunch. It just sounds ridiculous, but it also sounds like something you would want. And I think doing those things at the same time, making something ridiculous, something silly, something to be made fun of, but also something to be criticized because of the kind of human behavior it has within it, but also make it attractive, also make it alluring, also make it comforting and make it understandable, I think is a very, very difficult job. And that's where I think Wimbledon Green really surpasses so many other comics that I read, that it absolutely transports you the way that both these books do. The way that Taste of Chlorine takes you to the swimming pool, a way that Bloody Chester takes you to that ghost town. It's about immersion. It's about creating characters, worlds, and situations that readers can absolutely 100% believe exists, and exists not like you're not fooled into thinking it exists. You know what I mean? It's the idea that so much thought has gone into shaping the world and shaping the characters that you can't help but be mesmerized by the act that these writer artists are pulling off. So that's my review of these three, of why I think they're great. And now I think I'll talk a little bit, at least about Bloody Chester, and a little bit about one part of Taste of Chlorine, and one just as a sampler. And I think and it's not going to be a spoiler for Taste of Chlorine and for Wimbledon Green. It might be a little bit of a spoiler for Bloody Chester, but because this book seems hard to find, and because people are saying it's not in print, etc., I really want people to know about this book and to understand one thing that I read about this book that it was criticized for. Let me put it this way. It's a good criticism, and I think it's a worthwhile thing to keep in mind. This book, not only is it not for, it does have slurs in it. It has racial slurs in it. It has racial epithets in it. And in particular, it uses the N-word. Only in one scene, only from one character in the middle of one conversation, he uses it twice. But you also use a lot of other words for Native Americans, for Chinese people, for Irish people, although Irish people are just called Irish. The idea of who works the railroads and what kind of genocide is taking place in America is a big part of Bloody Chester. But a criticism that I read, I think, online was that it doesn't need to use this language. And then there are other people who said, well, it's talking about the West and that's what they used in those days. And I think that's a little bit of an easy thing. I've often heard it, it's just like, well, that's just what happened in those days. So it's like, I do think that people need to be responsible. I think people need to understand why they're using language a particular way. In Bloody Chester, it's one of those examples where people says, well, if it's necessary for the story. I'll say that in the way that Incognegro, it's a book by Matt Johnson and Warren Pleece that I've talked about in another live stream. Incognegro, about a black man going undercover in the Deep South during the Civil Rights era in order to investigate a lynching, was full of language that would be offensive, but it was authentic. It was needed because of the environment it was talking about. Now, someone can say, well, when you're making Bloody Chester and you're making a colorful first, second comic, what's the need of having that? And this is another book like Incognegro, where I find that it is not just something that I'm okay with because, it was part of the time. It's like, no, the story requires it. And this is why I think it's maybe a little unfairly underrated. Not only is that language used to show how villainous this person is, that might be too cartoony, it is something that is the general way of speaking, that's all that. But very much a lot of this book is about language. As I said, why is Bloody Chester called Bloody Chester? Why is the town called this town? And what language people use and how they use this language to look at their world and to define their world and to think about their world is a significant part of Bloody Chester. Another small spoiler, I mean, not another, the only small spoiler is that Bloody Chester ends with a resolution in which they find out what's been going on. And that's where some people expected something spooky, something along the lines, I don't know, of some slasher movie or of a zombie movie and things like that, because that's where certain things were pointing, like a plague, and there are all these decayed bodies, and they look terrible. They don't look like anything natural, and that's where it's headed. And we find out that's not the case, and we find out that the plague is not what we thought it was, and it doesn't come from where we thought. And even that realization, that twist, isn't a twist because it doesn't take place in a lab. It doesn't take place in a shootout. I mean, it kind of does. But that revelation is completely based on racism. It's completely based on the racist nature of the people. It's about the genocide that has taken place in order to have these white settlers over here in the first place. It's about on whose backs they have built these things. And once again, completely given to you in slow bits and pieces of world building. No lectures, no big thing. It's just someone you meet. What's going on over here? This is the answer they give. So I would say that not only is the racially charged language appropriate for the time, which it doesn't have to be. You can write something that's set in the past and not show every single thing and talk about it again. You are writing in the 21st century. You have to have the responsibility for what you're doing right now. But the story is very much about that. And I think that some people, in their disappointment with the ending not being a horror movie, not being a zombie movie, don't see that. They maybe overlook that connection, that the reason why this language exists right at the beginning of the story is because it's indelible from and it's very interesting, because it's interesting that once you have that, then someone saying Chinaman or someone saying Redskins or what have you, it doesn't sound as bad because they've already gone, so because we're looking at it from a modern sensibility. And I think there also the writer is doing a very clever thing, is that he's normalizing a certain kind of language, because he's already given you the worst that you consider the worst, and everything else is okay compared to that. And so you've become okay, and you've become a little bit more complicit with the other language of this era. It's very clever. It's very interesting in as far as the world building. What's most impressive to me, though, is in the way it plays out as far as the resolution of the story is. What is going on here? How did it happen? And we were told from the very beginning, and we didn't hear it because we don't think about language in the same way. That's about the worst kind of, that's the limit of my spoiler. It's such a thin, slim little book, and I do think that you shouldn't expect this to be War and Peace. I don't think you should expect this to be a mighty epic. It's a short story, but it's a short story done with a novel's weight and with a novel's ambition, but with a one-act play's delivery. The sparseness of it is part of what makes it hit so hard, because it isn't, as I was saying, it isn't bogged down by things. Taste of Chlorine, one thing that I can talk about, and there are lots of different things, and again, it's a slim book, so I don't want to get right to the end and what happens at the end. But one thing that really did stand out right at the beginning, when our protagonist first goes into the pool and he's changing, there's this 9-panel grid of his changing over here, and it's almost easy to miss but why is just him taking his pants on and putting on his trunks, why is that given the 9-panel treatment? Why is that broken down in such a way? And why is time slowed in that way? And then I realized there must be a reason for it. And as I was looking at it, I realized that's his underwear, that's his swimming briefs. He puts on his swimming briefs, he takes his shirt off, and then he takes his underwear off from inside his swimming briefs. So even inside the changing room, I get a sense of this boy or this young man's shyness. I get a sense of his discomfort at being in a public place and taking his clothes off, that he puts his swim trunks on over his underwear and then removes his underwear from inside. And then as he walks past everyone, once again, it's easy to just go past all of this, but by the time I got here, even over here and then in some other pages as well, everyone else is larger than him. Usually there are men with bellies and older than him, hairy chest, but every one of them is wearing briefs or Speedo looking swimsuits, and he's got boxer looking ones, which are more pants. Within these 2 pages and within these panels, we get a sense of this young man's modesty, his sense of self, his discomfort, his thinking about the body, and we're already presented an arena in which bodies are on display and put in front of you with a swim cap, sort of adding this sort of neutralization or democratization to everything. It's such elegant storytelling. It's so wonderfully done, where it's economical and it's effective. It's not hitting you over the head with it, but it's there clear as day for you to see. And this is what good storytelling to me is all about. It's where I have gotten a sense. And Taste of Chlorine, just like Bloody Chester, does this over and over again throughout its thing, is that I have gotten the idea. I understand what you're talking about. I understand the characters. I understand the situation they're in, and I understand what they're dealing with. This, to me, is the sign of consistency, of an internal consistency, where you've created a world and you've created characters with so much fidelity to accuracy. You're imagining a full thing. You're not just having someone tell a joke because you need a gag. You're not having someone say, oh, no, you didn't just say that, which isn't really a joke anyway. You're not just having snark. You have commentary, you have conversation, you have silence, you have things that complete things. And that consistency is what I think is good storytelling. Good writing, good art means they're doing that storytelling in a way that I don't think they're cheating, and I can't find any cracks in it. And that's why when people don't talk about those works and they talk about books much less accomplished, if I could put it that way, that's where I feel the underrating part of it comes in, is that craft is craft, irrespective of the length of the work, irrespective of the genre of the work, irrespective of your expectations from it. I can play with those expectations. I can play with the expectations of a Western or with comic book collectors, etc. But craft is going to come down to how well have you been able to put something before your viewers, before your readers, that they are in no doubt about. And these books do that, whether, even with a completely circular protagonist as Wimbledon Green. There's one part in the story where he's talking about Les Moore, who's a great comic artist, and one of his greatest comics, according to Wimbledon Green, was a comic about 2 hobos, and it ran for 17 issues, and Wimbledon Green is the only person who has all 17 of them in mint condition in the world. But these hobos represented a certain kind of wish that the author of those comics had. This is a comic within a comic, so he's obviously giving it to you from the point of view of Wimbledon Green lecturing people on what makes this comic great. But the wandering hobo on the road seems to be a theme that keeps coming up in this book about auction houses and about collections and about CGC slabs and encased in lucite and plastic wrap and mylar bags. There's this yearning for leaving things behind that's being told by the stories that all of these people who want not to leave these things behind are all about. What it means is the story is all about freedom. The story is all about non-materialism, the comic. But everyone who wants to collect that comic wants to collect it because it's such a great story about non-materialism. I must own it in mint condition. There is this humorous satire of it that is something that happens over and over again in this story. There is a famous artist who has been at a convention all day sketching, and Wimbledon Green, as a young fan, is dogging him for a sketch, and he's just exhausted and he wants to go home, and Wimbledon Green is following him home, and it's presented as a sort of gag. But even over there, you can see that what really matters to this collector, what really matters to this fan of comics, what really matters is get an autograph, is to get the sign or to get a sketch. I must have a sketch. I'm not interested in the human being that the artist is. I'm not interested in the person who's tired. I'm interested in the person who can make me a sketch. And this is something that every collector embodies in some way or the other. That's the avarice. And there's one scene, it's an odd kind of sequence in which Wimbledon Green, in very comic book fashion, gets knocked unconscious, loses his memory, and doesn't know who he is. And he just becomes a hobo, and he's wandering the countryside for about 3 or 4 days before something, and that something is fun, that sparks his memory, a comic book, and he remembers who he is. But those few sequences in which he doesn't remember who he is, and he's just giving himself up to eloquently describing how wonderful this open free road is, it lasts for a very little time, because then he's back to being Wimbledon Green. Somewhere when you end the book and you wonder what happened to him, you wonder if that's what he did. Maybe he just gave everything up, and maybe he just took off on the road. And then others are not, nope, I think he entered the world of coin collecting. But it's a book that stays with you and makes you think about things that are much more than about comics collecting. And I think from that point of view, I find it a magnificent work. I find all three of these magnificent works, in spite of the brevity of the first two, and even Wimbledon Green. I mean, there's nothing. This is like, what, 1/4 the size of Clyde fans. It doesn't matter, because what they do is so perfect and so fully formed, so consistent, so focused on character, and so unique in its presentation that you can't mistake it for anything else. And I think, as a concluding thought, that's what I have. It's the same one that I had in the previous live stream, is that I think certain things are underrated for the very reasons. Oh, let me start that again. I think certain things are underrated because people don't talk of them very highly, as highly as I think. So I think some things are underrated because I think people should talk more highly of them. But people don't talk highly of them because they have criticisms. But to me, the things they're criticizing are the things that make the work great. That's what keeps it from being machine produced, everyday stuff that everybody does and imitates and regurgitates. It's something unique and it's something special. Like, I don't like this for its art style. I've had conversations like that all the time. I'm sure most of you have had. I can't do anything about that. You know, if you just don't like a particular kind of art, if you think everything should look one way, that's different. But if you think this is the wrong art style for this story, I get that. I have seen that many times. I'm like, this does not match the story it wants to tell. But there are certain books that know what they're doing, and they know that this art style not matching that story will create a different kind of story. And I think that's different. And I think the way that Bloody Chester works is that way. It's like, I understand what you think of as a Western art style, but what I'm going to give you is something that is as much Scott Pilgrim as it is The Searchers. And that is unusual to people. And that's what brings lightness, and that's what brings comedy to something that is quite bleak. But at the same time, I can still have ellipses. I can still have a sideways glance. I can still have a quick cut and a quick whip pan, even if it's not for slapstick, because that comic's vocabulary is now being harnessed to tell a different kind of story. And I think that's great. Taste of Chlorine, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything, you know. It's terrible. Nothing happens. Nobody comes or goes. It's like those kind of critiques aren't real critiques. The way that someone entering the water and stretching, and another person not setting up for their lap but waiting, crouched, waiting to push back while she stretches, this is storytelling. It's doing something for me. It's doing something with the way that it's doing, the way it's showing color, the way it's showing what's underwater and what's above water, and the way the lines are. It's creating not just mood and place, but it's creating a story in a way that is unfaultable because I'm there. And even something as funny and as satirical and as absurd as Wimbledon Green ends up having that kind of power where it seems to be saying a lot about a lot of different things through something that is just barely removed from waiting for government or best in show or something like that. And then you end up having this resonance that you as a reader have had because of how well this world has been made. So I think that kind of craft is good storytelling. That kind of good storytelling makes good comics, irrespective of what we expected and what we wanted. Yeah, so that's my spiel. Bloody Chester by I keep forgetting, J.T. Petty and Hilary Florido. Wimbledon Green by Seth, and Taste of Chlorine by Bastien Vives. 3 fantastic comics, ones that I really, really love, but I also think contain things that make good comics, that makes good storytelling, and sometimes those are the very things that seem to put people off. But that's my conclusion. Thank you so much for joining me over here. I have a lot of comments over here, but I think people are just chatting amongst themselves. I don't think there are any questions for me. Larry McMurtry, yes, I've read a couple of Larry McMurtry stuff, which I really like, and Gore Vidal lost a first edition of Nabokov to Larry McMurtry. That's pretty funny. Everyone should check out the chat and the comments. But it is now 1 o'clock. Oh no, it's 1:22. I overshot a little bit. I thought I'd be done by 1. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining me on this live stream. I hope you enjoyed this, whether you're watching this now or whether you're watching this later. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next